you're doing all these great simulators. I've got a lot of contacts and stuff inside of Microsoft. Let's just expand the business and see if we can't go further. And so we did. So we switched. So we joined forces and we switched the name from Palace to Exam Solutions is what we called the company. We're developing simulations and everything's going grand and we're getting bigger and bigger deals.
Welcome to Venture Unscripted, a podcast where we talk with founders and entrepreneurs about their journey from 0 to 1.
Welcome to Venture Unscripted. Today with me I've got Thad Senti. He is City Innovation's Chief Digital Officer. And this will be an interesting and fun episode because normally we interview people that are on different teams, different startups, and now we've got someone on our team that's got their own history, their own entrepreneurial history.
Right.
And so I'm really excited because I think having people on our team makes us, with that experience, makes us a really strong team.
Yep.
So welcome, Thad.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, glad to be here.
Oh,
It'll be a good time, an interesting conversation, I'm sure.
Absolutely. You and I could talk for hours about anything.
We could indeed.
We were just talking about how we could talk about aliens and ancient Egypt and all sorts of various topics. But
yes.
I don't think that's
Area
people.
51.
Yeah, they would not want to hear us talk about those things.
But I want to talk about those things.
I do too. Maybe in a separate one.
I'm the guest.
Yeah. I'm the guest. This is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But I'd love for you to give a little bit of background about you, and then
Sure.
we'll go into a little bit more about your entrepreneurial journey.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I've been doing development and in the technical sector for, I would say, 28, 29 years now, which dates me a little bit, but of course my gray hair does that already, so there's no hiding it. And I originally thought, my dad was a high school teacher in biology, and I actually thought I was going to go into biology, and that's what I started.
They worked out.
But it was always around computers growing up, and I always enjoyed them, but really didn't see them as something that you could have a career around.
Mm-hmm.
What would you do? They were always something to play with, not necessarily program. And I remember going over to a friend's house. This was maybe in 7th grade, and he had a Commodore VIC-20. And he showed me that the basic programming language, and he said he wrote a for loop that printed his name over and over again on the screen.
Yeah. And
it went across and down. It's on a black and white TV. And that just blew my mind. I was like, that is so amazing.
When for first experience it.
So here's this tool, here's this thing, and you can control it.
Yeah.
And so I taught myself a little bit of basic programming, but I still didn't really see it as something that I was going to do with my life, and just put it away, and then went to school, went to college. And my first year, I was interacting with a guy who was in computer science, a freshman who was in computer science, and he had an Amiga. I think it was an Amiga 500, which is like the next
step up.
A few generations past the VIC-20, like 10 years past that or whatever. And it had a really sophisticated graphics chip in it. It had embedded sprites, a sprite chip in it. And so like the games and what you could do on it was very sophisticated for its time.
Yes.
Compared to, say, the Atari 2600 or whatever that was out there as a gaming console, which was very primitive in terms of graphics. And so I was intrigued because it was the most sophisticated computer that I had seen at the time. And he also had this system where he could hack things without going into great detail. Back in those days, companies would have a 1-800 number that, as a businessman, if you worked for that company, you would use this 1-800 number and call it, and then in turn you'd call the long distance number that you wanted to actually call, and that way the company paid for the charges.
For it. Yeah.
So you would dial the number, you'd enter in a code, then you'd enter in your phone number, and then it would go through and the salesman or whatever could go on with their business. What hackers were doing at the time is they would use their computer. Somewhere they would get these 1-800 numbers. I don't know where those came from, but they would get huge catalogs of these 1-800 numbers. And the key was to figure out what the code was, so then you could do it. And so you would hook up the...
So you could freely call
So
long
you
distance.
could make a free long distance
Yeah.
call, which a college kid really needs that. So I call home once a year. It cost me $2. So why do I need to do this? But so they would hook up a modem. The modem would make a call to a BBS, a bulletin board system.
Yeah.
It would first dial this 1-800 number out of the database, whatever. Then it would try a random code, wait a few seconds. Then it would call the bulletin board system. Now, if the code worked, the bulletin board system would respond.
Yeah.
So the computer would know it got a hit. And so therefore that code was good, and it would squirrel that away. So it would take a 1-800 number and try 1,000 different combinations of codes. And if it got one, it would be a hit. If it didn't, it'd just move on to the next 1-800 number. And so I hooked up my Commodore 64 that I had at the time. I thought, I'm going to try this. I'm going to load this software. I'm going to give this a shot. And I ran it overnight. This is at school, at college.
The FBI showed up, didn't they?
I just ran it overnight, and I got up the next morning, and there was one number on there that it worked. It actually worked. And I was just, this is amazing to me that you could have a system that's automated and can do all this work while you're, of course, it was hacking at the time, but it was more the intrigue of that you could automate a system and that you could interact with these analog devices like a modem and a bulletin board system and do it to achieve some outcome.
Yeah.
And so I ended up using that 1-800 number. I did this once. I called it and called home. And I'm like, Dad, this is a free long distance call. I'm saving like 10 cents.
Was he completely into it?
He was like, he had no idea what I'm talking about. You're nuts. And the conversation lasted a minute. And then I was too terrified to do it anymore.
You saved like $1.
Yeah, I saved like I never really did it again. But I switched my major. As a result, that's not the only experience, but as a result of interacting with this other guy, his name is Matt Ranney. He works for Uber now. He's like one of the architects over there in San Francisco. And, you know, he was he had such passion for it, and it was really infectious.
Yeah.
And so I switched. Then it was just like run of the mill, going to school, getting my degree. But I've always been entrepreneurial. I always, as a young kid, I was like, which is your original question,
yes.
like what's my background and everything. And I always wanted to have like my own pet store. That was one of the things I thought as a kid. I want to be a pet store owner.
Yes.
But I always had this mindset is I want to own the business. I want to be in control of my own destiny. And so that was really what was driving me as far as being in computer software. I was like, I'm just going to be a consultant, like write software. Knowing how I was going to get there, I ended up switching schools and going to Colorado State University, Colorado. There was a professor on sabbatical there from Utah State University. And I didn't know this. I was just in the computer science program, but I was looking for a job. And I had an apartment, and I'm like, I got to pay the rent. And this was before the internet. So there you're looking at the classifieds for jobs. And there was 2 of them in there that interested me. There was one, it was like you could be a bag boy at the local grocery market, which I interviewed for.
Yes.
And got the job, right? And I'm like, okay, great. I'm going to bag groceries, pay the rent, go to school.
Good first job.
And then the other one was looking for a C+ programmer to just do some research. And there was a couple skills in there I can't remember. It has knowledge of object-oriented programming and can demonstrate building classes and all these sorts of things. And I had self-taught myself a lot of this. I wasn't quite there yet in school, but I was way ahead of everybody else just because I picked up Borland, Turbo C, and taught myself C++. And I had written a number of just little silly demos and things like that. And during this period of time, speaking of demos, they literally called them demos. And so the graphics cards were getting more sophisticated, and developers would write against usually techno music or something. And a lot of this came out of the European scene. So techno dance music to these really incredible visuals. Now we don't think anything of it. It's like it's all automatic, but this was all programmed. So it's all these sine waves and these like mathematical graphs, and it just was amazing. And so I wanted to do something like that. It's like I did not have the artistic skill to even had no business trying. But in doing so, I had to write like drivers for the mouse. Like these things didn't exist. And so if you wanted to have the mouse interact with it in a certain way, you're going to have to get down to the bare metal, do some assembly language programming, interact with the interrupts and stuff to like control the mouse and then have that draw the mouse on the screen. So I wrote all these classes to do all this stuff. And I ended up figuring I'm just going to bring that to this job and see if this guy bites. And it's this professor who's on sabbatical. He was a hydrologist. And he was working for the National Biological Survey in Fort Collins to like study fish habitat.
Yeah.
And so I showed him what I had and everything. And the short of it is he gave me the job. Come in and start.
You know what you're doing.
You come in and start developing. And so then after school was over, I'd go and I was actually getting paid to develop software, which is what I always wanted to do, but I was just mind blown.
Yes.
Plus it was in a research field, which was super interesting. So it was wide open in terms of how you would develop and what you could develop. And then we ended up building something on top of Windows 3.0. So Windows 3. Not Windows 3.1, Windows 3.0.
Predecessor.
The predecessor. And that's where I got my first crack at understanding message queues and event queues, because that's the way the original Windows all worked. It would generate these events. You'd have to consume those events, and they might be mouse move events, they might be click events or whatever, and respond to those. And so I got a lot of experience in just GUI experience in that space before there was such things as user experience design and customer experience design and all that kind of stuff. So that just translated into Then he offered me a full-time job at Utah State University. So I went there and then ended up teaching graduate students as an undergraduate computer programming, which was really ironic. But they were graduate students in the hydraulic, like fish and wildlife space. So they didn't necessarily have any sort of computer background. So it was a nice marriage because they didn't have to be perfect.
Yes.
If I were teaching computer science students,
Now,
I'd probably have to be a little more.
Is this when we're going to put up on the screen Thad's photo of when he was a young lad, and then you had sent that off, and is that around
That's
that
in
time?
that era, yeah. So I went to work for Utah State University, and it just so happens that this professor was also very much an entrepreneur. He had his own businesses, and so we really connected on this. And so we decided to form a company together, called it Palace Incorporated. So P-A-L-A-S, which is like the Greek god of wisdom or something. It's just,
wow.
I look back on it and it's such a stupid name, but we thought it was cool. We thought we were cool at the time. And so through a sort of a long meandering story, which I won't necessarily get into now, we got into learning management systems. And we got hooked up with the education.
And for first, real quick, what was the premise behind when you started this company? Like, what was the original premise with, you're starting it, you're like, we're going to do X, and did that change?
Yes, we started off thinking that we were going to build software around hydraulics. And in fact, we did, because we had a contract with the Department of Transportation. And they had asked us to automate, or at least create a sort of basically a hydraulics calculator that would operate under Windows so that they wouldn't have to do all these things by hand, particularly around how to design culverts. So there's quite a science around the size of the culvert and how the speed of the water going through and how you break up the water as it passes through.
Those are those concrete blocks with they're hollow.
Yeah, that's a culvert, or even the round ones, the big corrugated metal ones.
Sure.
That go under bridges or go under roads. And if you get it wrong, the road washes out. It can be real dangerous, whatever. So there's a whole science around it. And I didn't know anything about hydraulics, but he did. But I knew everything about programming. So he was the subject matter expert, and I was the guy that would turn it into computer code. And we thought we could sell this. We're like, let's sell this. And so we tried a couple of gearheads, no sense of marketing or what.
Yeah.
And it's not really going anywhere.
Yeah.
Who's going to buy the market for a hydraulic calculator for like under road hydraulics?
Overwhelming amount of
free. So that never went anywhere. And then we got interesting. I don't know how we got this, but we got this deal to write a certification test for police officers using a radar gun. When a police officer tags you with a radar gun or a laser gun, they've gone through training, which then means that if they write you a ticket, they've got the supporting training to say they know how to use the thing, and the victim, as it were, can't say, you don't know how to use it. They go through this training. And it's very expensive to bring the police officers into a single place to take this training. Now, this is before the internet.
Yeah.
Gopher, I think, was just starting to come out. And I don't know if anybody knows what Gopher is, but we can talk about that. It's like like a predecessor to
it's
HTML.
a protocol. Yeah, the Gopher protocol.
Like share documents.
That's old school.
Really primitive.
Yes.
Yeah. So they would have to bring all the officers in, or if it was a remote county or something, which in Utah there are very remote counties that have maybe two a sheriff and a deputy. So to have the deputy leave, the force is cut in half.
Yes.
And so they were looking for ways to train people remotely. We said, we can do that. We'll write up certification software.
Yeah.
So you'll interact with the test, and once you're done with the test, it'll transmit the results via modem to a central server. So we built that, and through that I had to learn how to do like Z modem and learn about network protocols and how all of that exchange happens. Plus, we started getting into the whole learning management areas, testing. And that went okay. We had a couple police stations, as it were, departments, actually go through it and certify that way in Utah. But that never really went anywhere, and that got us into the education department at Utah State University. And that's where things really blew up. What we ultimately ended up doing is writing certification simulators. So at the time, like the Microsoft Certified Network Engineer, the MCSE, for instance, or the CNE from Novell was big, Certified Network Engineer. IBM had certifications, and Oracle had certification programs. This whole concept around getting a certification was very big in the late 90s, early 2000s. And you still hear about it today, but not like you did then. That was like getting a diploma. If you had those letters, then you would win the job over anybody else. It was all multiple choice at the time, delivered on 386s at these testing centers all around the United States or wherever. And they were Microsoft looking for a way to test using the actual software. So like, rather than asking questions about like, how would you apply permissions to make this person an administrator, and then give them like 6 options that they have to choose from. Instead, ask them to create a user named John Doe and give them these administrative privileges and this access to these network drives. See if they did that with the actual software, like to do it. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
And they tried to figure out ways like, how can we have them use the actual software to do it? And we said, we'll just simulate it. And this is when Borland Delphi had come out. So it was very easy at the time to create user interfaces, especially ones that already existed. You were just copying the systems that were already there and then putting enough code behind it to make it look like you had actually created this user and actually assigned them the permissions. But the user doesn't really exist. The permissions don't actually stop you from doing anything. But as far as those tasks went, it looked and felt like you were interacting with the actual. And so that blew up. And Microsoft, we had several contracts through Microsoft, many through Novell. We were working with WordPerfect and IBM and Intel, Oracle. They all wanted a piece of this because they didn't want to be the low man on the certification scene. They wanted to have the coolest technology.
So how did you convince the second and third?
In the simulation space?
Yeah.
The first customer was Novell.
Okay.
The networking company that doesn't exist anymore.
Yes.
And it was really through a series of connections. We were brought in through really 2 layers.
Yeah.
So there was a company at the time called Galton Technologies in Provo, Utah. And they were specialists in certification on the whole. They would write the tests and exams and all these things. And so that was started by a guy who worked at Novell in there. It wasn't in full-blown engineering, but it may have even been in the certification, like the marketing and stuff. So just disseminating information and training people. He was a trainer. And so he started a new company because he wanted to apply technology to this. And so he had an inside on Novell. And he knew the director at Utah State University in the education department. So they were talking to each other about learning management systems and applying technology to examination and testing and training. And because we were at Utah State University and gotten that radar contract just on a fluke, and it was in this learning space, that caught the wind of the director of the education. So he's with me down to Provo, Utah. Let's talk to these guys, and you can show them what you've done and what you're doing with simulations and so on in Delphi. And so we did that, and they were just like, this is incredible. It's like, how fast can you turn around a simulation? It's so many weeks and such money. And we were charging between 100 and 150 grand per simulation.
Yeah.
Which was quite a bit back then. I guess it'd be the equivalent, probably 250 these days. So we were feeling pretty good. And that, once we did a couple of those for Novell, and this same company, Galton Technologies, got in bed with Microsoft and was selling them how to build right tests and the right way to do it. So they were just selling the concept, the academics of how you test in a good way, where we were just technology nerds. We didn't know anything about learning management systems or anything, just building software. But Microsoft wanted to get in that game as well. And so then we started building simulations for Microsoft, for like the network administrative stuff to portions of Microsoft Word. We emulated just the desktop.
Yeah.
And what was so good about that exercise for me, because I was just a developer at the time, I was really forced to think about how I would build this software on an enterprise level.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just, I'm going to build this hydraulics calculator, which you just do whatever you want. You're looking at software, the most sophisticated software that was out there at the time, that went through design principles, but they had a bigger budget to do that and place the buttons and how are we going to make all this software come together. And you're having to write software that acts just like that. And so you ended up running into a lot of the same challenges about scale and how you store your objects and how you interact with the software and how you control the events and keep it manageable, because the more that you poured into that simulator, the bigger the software got. And now you're dealing with practically like the son of Windows 3.1 because you're doing so much of it. In some cases, the line was so blurry, it was actually doing what the actual software We would have to do that in order to make the simulation seem realistic enough.
Yes.
And it was a hard line sometimes to
figure that out.
To draw about, like, how can we fake this and still make it look real? Or do we actually have to do the thing that it does? And sometimes you would. And so we got really good at making software fast. And that's when the sort of the rapid application development principles started to bubble up in the early 2000s and that was all centered around these WYSIWYG builders that were becoming the rage, like Delphi being one, Chromedia game.
And it feels like the go-to-market strategy, you almost fell into it. Is that right? Would you agree with that? It's because some professor had a connection. That connections are everything, early stage. And it's like you fell into that, and then one thing led to another because you proved it with Novell. All of a sudden, people like Microsoft got wind of it, and it evolved from there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. It definitely did. And it was all quite by accident. We didn't think, and we should have, but we didn't think very hard about how we would market or get it out there. We really just thought we were tool builders.
Yes.
We knew how to make tools that did things.
Right.
And so then that's as far as our business model went. I never thought about the types of things we talk about today around, is it the right thing to build? Does it make sense? Or going out and having a discussion with the customer first, unheard of.
Yeah.
We wouldn't do that. It's like we knew very exactly what they wanted. I look at the radar exam. I would have approached that, and we should have approached that completely different. We should have started with the police officer.
Yes.
And talked to them, but instead we got a copy of the written test and turned it into a digital version and slapped a UI around it and hoped that they could navigate and understand it. And we ran into all kinds of weird user problems, and we just couldn't figure it out.
It was a user's problem, though.
Right, exactly. It was like, why can't you understand that this is the button that you need to click to go to the next question or whatever?
Idiots.
So dumb. They're so dumb. I have a funny, and I know that we got to cut this part out. We've got to watch the time. Okay, we're good. We got plenty of time. There was a police officer conference in Oregon, Portland, Oregon, and they invited us to present. And the professor that I was working with, he didn't have time to go, so he's like, you go.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm probably 22, 23 at the time. I've never been in front of a crowd. I've never done any public speaking. But you can do it. You just go and do a demo of the certification.
What a great experience, though. Just throw you in the deep end.
It was good, except, and I wish I still got it on VHS tape somewhere because they recorded it. So I'm up there on stage, and there's 300 police officers in uniform in this big ball. The guy gives an introduction. This is Thad Senti from Palace Incorporated, and they have this software that's going to revolutionize the way we do certifications in the police field. And so I get up there, and I'm going through, and everything's going fine, and I'm about three minutes into a 15-minute presentation. It's not going to be a real long presentation. And at the time, there was a bug in the database layer that Borland was fighting against, because I built this thing in Delphi, and I used this back-end system like the ODBC stuff and all these old drivers to interact with the database. And if it was in the form of a DLL, the dynamic link library, this is like a history lesson, and if this thing would load and crash, you would get this big white screen that would come up, and it'd be like error, blah, 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 and they'd hit to click OK. But back then, that DLL wouldn't get out of memory. Yeah. So if you tried to load the software up again, it would still go against that bad instance of the DLL. So that happened, and they were projecting on it. I had it was a huge screen behind me. It was 20 feet tall by 40 feet wide. I'm up there.
You were like Steve Jobs.
It was that moment for me. Everything, or like when Elon Musk throws a ball at his new car that's not supposed to break, and it does. It just shatters the window. This terrible sinking feeling, and I'm like, so I'm trying to talk my through, and I was like, I'm going to have to reboot the whole computer, which takes forever back then. And so I'm going through this whole reboot process, and everyone's starting to talk among themselves. I've lost the crowd, right? And we didn't get any orders for that software. So yeah, that was a traumatic experience, a learning one too. Yeah, the demo's going bad.
Yes, you can't control
Murphy's
that.
Law. It just is going to happen.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's good. And then I think there was a fast forward a little bit. How far down the road, because you were talking about how you ended up talking in conversations with someone about selling the business. Is that right?
So this gets into a little more of the entrepreneurial aspect of it and some of the mistakes we made. Because obviously, if it had worked, I wouldn't be here talking with you in a seedy room with...
Hey, a lot of our other podcast people we have on, They've sold businesses.
Yeah.
Whether you're here or there, you'd just be in a different frame.
Different frame.
Yeah.
So learned a lot through this experience. So I ended up buying the professor out. So he was my business partner at the time. I bought him out and I moved the whole business to Denver and got a office in the Denver Tech Center. I brought with me a couple developers and hired a couple more on and was just doing the simulation business. And I was working with a director over at Microsoft by the name of Sean, and we started talking about forming a business together. So he's like, you're doing all these great simulators. I've got a lot of contacts and stuff inside of Microsoft. Let's just expand the business and see if we can't go further. And so we did. So we switched. So we joined forces and we switched the name from Palace to Exam Solutions, is what we called the company. We're developing simulations and everything's going grand and we're getting bigger and bigger deals. And at the time, the exam distribution software was created by Microsoft in Visual Basic to run on 486s, 386s, or whatever, and actually deliver the test. And they also developed portions of the test from Microsoft the MCSE, the other things. And they did this all in Visual Basic at the behest of Bill Gates. Bill Gates was very big on people within the company eating their own dog food. Visual Basic was his baby. And so regardless of whether or not it was the most appropriate technology for it, you had to use it. That's
Right.
what you had to develop in for these types of things, because they had C++, they had
Sure.
C++ compiler as well at the time. But the competitor, Borland's product, Delphi, was so much better at this. And there were other technologies at the time, like servlets, Java servlets and Java Beans, and there's just the other technologies that were really more appropriate and a lot more powerful to be able to deliver exams. And because Visual Basic was very resource hungry, it was crashing on these 386s that were delivering the tests. And the company that owned a huge pie of a huge sector of these delivery centers was Sylvan Prometric. They're still around and they still actually deliver
Oh, yeah.
exams.
big
And it's
exam
proctored
company.
exams is the
Yes.
idea. So you go there and there's somebody lording over you, watching to make sure you're
Don't
not
cheat.
cheating.
Yeah.
But the software that Microsoft was providing was eating up all these resources, and these testing consoles were crashing. They'd gobble up the resources. They'd have to reboot it. If there was a new exam that had a lot of, say, drag and drop sort of options in it and stuff, it would gobble up all these resources and it would crash. And we caught wind of that through my connection, Sean, because he was a director there. And he was a part of that division that was building this software. And so he and I are talking on the sly about we could build something better.
Yes.
And so let's set about doing it. Let's not talk to anybody. Let's just build it, which we did. And then let's approach Sylvan Prometric with this new solution, which is lean, it's fast, it's easy to install, it's easy to deploy, and it has all these extra features in it. Not including,
Yes.
but all these different types of testing methodologies like reorder things or flashcards and all this stuff.
Right.
We built this entire testing system and decided to present it to Sylvan Prometric, which we did. And we also thought, once we get Sylvan Prometric on the hook, won't Microsoft be glad to hear about this, because we're going to solve all of Microsoft's problems, because they were really struggling. They were they were getting egg on their face because every time something would go wrong, it goes right back to them. And so we set up a meeting. We had a couple phone calls with Sylvan Prometric, and we finally ended up getting to the CEO of Sylvan Prometric, and he wanted to see this technology.
How many phone calls did it take to get to the...
I would say there was probably 4 to 6 conversations. It took a while to gain confidence, and he had to understand who we were and what we were doing. But we had the simulation business, and those were running through his centers.
Yes.
So he was familiar with that. And Sean, working at Microsoft, of course, Sean had all the ins and knew the people there. Sean's boss was, or 2 bosses up, was a gal named Cindy, which will be material to this story as we go forward. And so Sean knew Cindy, and the president of Sylvan Prometric knew Cindy, because this is once you get into the simulation, the certification business, a lot of these people all know each other. They all go to the same conferences, and they all meet and exchange ideas. What are you doing? Do you have a new system? Whatever. And so we rented a conference room at Denver International Airport. This is the new one. This is when it was just built and new. So this is, early 2000s. And had him fly in And we put this big presentation together. It was just Sean and I. And we had other developers in the company, but it was just he and I going to give the presentation. And we're going to talk to him about what we're doing and that would he be interested in licensing the software, buying it or whatever. And we had caught through the wind that he would be interested in buying and owning the software and having that the foundation for his testing centers. And in my mind, I'm thinking, at this time, I'm married and I have a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old. So just a young family. I'm still very much in the throes of just building software. That's my role in the company, is writing software. And Sean had his PhD in business. So he knew, he had the business sense of what to go for and what not to go for. But we were still very much a technology company. We didn't think in terms of like today about marketing and talking to the users first and like that. And we're in this meeting and it comes time to start talking about money. And I'm thinking to myself, this is going to be $1,000. We're going to ask for $500,000. And how stupid is it that we didn't even have the conversation, Sean and I, about if it goes this direction,
What are we going to say?
what are we going to say?
Yeah.
Just flying by the seat of your pants, doing it live. It's so ridiculous. But Sean had it all figured out in his head. And he goes, and I'll never forget the number. And I still to this day, I'm not sure how he came up with it. But he goes, 17.3 million.
Holy moly.
For this technology. And I just froze. Right. I'm just sitting there going, what did I just hear? And I look
You're like,
over
that's a little larger than my 500.
I look over to the CEO of Sylvan Prometric, and he's not even batting an eye. That sounds fairly reasonable. He says, let's get started on some contractual negotiations and see what we can do. And so I was like, we did it. We made it. And during this period, it's like that's what would happen. It's like people were writing software, and like at Silicon Valley was just starting to blow up. And it's like there's all these entrepreneurs that are just going out.
Yes.
They're gearheads. They just build the software. And then this investor comes along and loves it. And you're done. You've made
17 million.
17 million. You've made your money. So that was the model. It's like you just work real hard, get the thing as close to finished and perfect as you can, and go out and try and find a buyer.
What year was this?
This was probably, I want to say it's like 2000. Somewhere between 2003 to 2000. Because, yeah, I ended up in Michigan shortly after the conclusion of this story. We're thrilled. We're like, okay, we've got this thing, and now we just gotta execute. But there's about 4 weeks or so where things are going good, and we're lining up, and we're gonna meet with the CEO and get it finalized.
Yeah.
And he's ready. He's like, come on over to this conference. We're gonna sign. And then the next day, we get a call from the CEO, and we've got a problem. I don't think we're going to be able to go forward with this product. And we're just like, what happened? Everything was going well. And he's like, we got a call from Microsoft. And essentially Microsoft, boss's boss of Sean, Cindy, caught wind that we had this technology that we were going to get it into Sylvan Prometric. Now, in our minds, we're like, Microsoft's going to love us. But we completely misread because
they were threatened.
They were threatened because, one, they were into it for probably, I'd say, $3 to $4 million in development costs of trying to get this VB6 or VB5, whatever it was, monolith running.
Yes.
And so her head was on the chopping block. Quite a few people's heads were on the chopping block. If they move away, and Sylvan was the biggest consumer of this, if they move away from this solution, it's going to look really bad for Visual Basic. It's going to look really bad for Microsoft. So she basically called him up and said, if you go with this, we're pulling our business out of Sylvan Prometric. We're not going to do it. You can't go with these guys. These are just two nerd guys that don't know anything, and I'm not going to stand for it. And Sylvan Prometric was like, yeah, I'm not going to destroy my whole business for these guys. And I'd rather use this poorer solution than go with the nice new shiny thing and lose all my business.
Yes.
And so we went from zero to like riches back to rags, like in the course of 4 weeks. And I look back on it, and I just couldn't believe it. It took me a long time to understand, why wouldn't someone pick the better technology? Always. Why isn't the better technology the one that should win?
Yeah.
Totally naive of the politics involved and the business facets that are involved in big deals. It's much more complicated than just creating the best thing and then everybody's going to see the light. And I look back on it, people ask me, what would you have done differently? And I think we would have approached Microsoft first and danced around that very carefully about like, how do we help you look good? And how do we improve your software? And is there a way for us to integrate your VB6 platform with our Delphi platform and without upsetting obvious politics that you have in doing something like that? But we just didn't see that coming. We just didn't see it coming. And that was it. That was done.
And then what happened after that? Where it's because you had some other things on the table. Did it gradually?
A couple things happened then that sort of finally put a fork in it and caused us to close up shop. The first was then the .com bubble burst.
Yes.
We just started to see those contracts for building simulations and building tests just dry up.
Yeah.
And I've heard different people argue, no, that doesn't happen. They pour more money because they need the training, because they have to have fewer people doing more things. But my experience was not that, at least as far as having exams that were this sophisticated. That just disappeared, and they just went back to like the basic multiple choice, things that will run easily and don't require a lot of resources or graphic resources, a lot of technology happen. And so we just saw our business dry up. And the second was like, obviously Microsoft was pretty angry with us, and so we saw that dry up.
Yes.
And Sean he stayed for a while, but he ended up, and even Microsoft. It was just, things just fell apart.
Oh.
But yeah, I think it would have been salvageable if we had just gone about it differently.
Yeah.
But we were too loud about how great we were. And we were good. We were really good.
Beating your drum pretty loudly.
But we were beating it pretty loudly, and we weren't paying attention to the people that were going to be threatened or hurt by what we were doing.
Yeah.
And you're dealing with, obviously, the 600-pound gorilla, too. It's Microsoft.
Yes.
You're not, what was in our heads thinking that we could go and do that and bring the giant down, which really wasn't our intention either, but we had a little. It's we're going to show these guys up, but they're going to love it. We're going to show them how terrible they are, but they're going to love it.
They're going to love us for that.
They're a technology company, and you're going to think that that's the coolest thing in the world.
If you could sum up 3 takeaways in a generic way for people listening to say, as entrepreneurs, people doing their new idea, what are like 3 things that you learned through that experience that you're like, make sure you do these things?
Yeah. I think the first one, and this is something that City is doing really well, and we say build the right thing and build the thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very good principle going forward, because you save yourself a lot of money. And we went down a lot of dead ends trying to build what we thought was the right thing without speaking to anybody first about it. There's all kinds of dead bodies in the history of exam solutions in terms of the software we wrote. So nobody wants that. Why did you write that?
Yeah.
Why are you doing this? So I think that's one. Another real big one that I learned, I spoke about this, is understand the players in the environment that you're entering into. Particularly if you're trying to disrupt, if you're trying to be a disruptor, you better really know who is holding the purse strings. Because if you go to someone like we did with Silverport MedPro, and you think that they'll see the light, which they did, and that they would then be willing to go up against
Right.
the 600-pound gorilla, you're fooling yourself.
Yeah.
But you really have to understand the ecosystem and play politics, understand the politics of the situation. And that's really difficult for an entrepreneur, someone who's new getting in, to understand, because you feel that your idea is invincible.
Yeah.
And the technology will speak for itself. And that's just not true.
Yeah.
That there's thousands of pieces of software being used out there that are far from the best version. And the best versions often never got anywhere because they failed to market, they failed to read the tea leaves and see who the competitors were and who knew who.
Yeah.
So knowing the right people and having the right advocates can really make a difference and can make you a success, even if you don't have the most perfect solution. So that's one. And then a third one is don't ever stop trying, because you're going to fail.
Yes.
And it sounds cliche, try again, but it really is true. And take a break from it if you're burnt out.
Yes.
It happens to everybody. But if you really are truly an entrepreneur and you've got that in your heart, it just never goes away. Even got out of the entrepreneurial small business for a number of years and worked in the corporate world. And I was never particularly happy there. It's like, that's when I really knew what I was, by testing those waters out and see what it was like to work in a situation like that. But I never stopped thinking of ideas, even when I was doing that.
Yes.
I'd go home and I would build something.
Yeah.
And try it. It just is just in your blood if you have that desire, that creative desire to do something. and build something and own it.
Yes.
And then see it be a success. So those are 3 things off the top of my head.
Those are great things.
Yeah.
I like it. Yeah. A big thing that stood out to me was, man, it just reemphasizes to know all the personas involved when you're like, rather than just laser focused on one, knowing, like you said, the competitive landscape is really important to know how is this going to sit in the market and position itself against other offers. How is it going to make the other partners feel in the deal? So
that's right.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And that's part of the fun and the challenge of it is the thought of disrupting.
Yes.
And being the winner. I mean, that's part of being an entrepreneur. That's fun.
Yes.
But don't be naive either. If you're going to go into the fighting ring and you don't know anything about your opponent or who he has to answer to, and suddenly you're trying something out and be like, oh, I realized that, there was somebody a lot higher pulling the strings and they've got a business deal going on over here that is directly competing with what you're doing, and they're going to pull you up by the short hairs. There you'll be.
Yes.
And I don't have any silver bullet answers of how to unpack all of that other than just be aware that it's there.
Yes.
That there's other people that are thinking the same thing you are, and they may be farther along, and they're not going to let their die. And there's some pretty vicious folks out there.
Yes.
That I guess that's the other thing. We were pretty altruistic in our motives. We thought this is going to just make things better.
Yes.
Even though it's for exams, it's better. And there's other people saying, nah, we're in it for the money. And if you get in our way, we're going to take you out.
Oh, man. What a fascinating story. It's really, thanks for sharing your startup story with us.
Yep.
And I'm honored to have you part of the City team because Thad has a ton of experience from starting from the very beginning all the way through, like you said, you worked at big companies and enterprise and scale. And so your experience is really valuable at City. So I appreciate you coming on.
Well, thanks, Josh. I really have enjoyed working at City. It's been a lot of fun and continues to be. It's just such an interesting time to be an engineer in this environment. I've seen it change so much as a developer and then as an architect and then as a manager, CTO, whatever, about the approach that you take in developing software, where, at least for me, starting out, I was doing all of the things.
Yes.
And now there's a lot of specialties. Your back-end developers, your cloud developers, you got your UI, UX design people, and that's all good. I think a lot of good things have come. But I've also found for me personally, if I'm on a larger team, I miss being able to touch all the different things and be a part of that whole creative process.
Yes.
So I find being in a role like I am now, I still get to do that. I may not necessarily be the coding across all of it.
Yes.
But I still get to be a part of all the conversations, from the basic metal all the way up to the UI and all the stuff in between. Yes. And I just get a kick.
That's awesome.
Good.
Thanks again, Thad.